So, I've been continuously rewriting the script for today. I did it yesterday, I did it listening to all of you. How to follow up in this? I mean, it's almost impossible. So strong witnesses telling us so much important things. Who am I to say anything? I'm a scientist, I'm also a fascist, probably. But I'm trying, as all of us are doing, trying to be looking into all the problems that we see connected with sexual harassment and sexual violence in different respects. And I prepared a presentation that was supposed to take us through important issues, and I will stick to it to some part, I think, at least, right? So, what do we do at the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research? We do a lot. We do a lot of research on sexual harassment at the moment. We have several assignments going on, and at the Secretariat we also have NICK, the Nordic Information on Gender, that is commissioned by the Nordic Council of Nordic Council of Ministers. And we have published two interesting reports that I think you know of already, but they're worth mentioning. The first one year after MeToo, describes and documents the events that took place on the legal, political levels in the Nordic countries, and gave some examples of best practice. And then the other one, Ending Sexual Harassment, a Precondition for Gender Equality, was actually released during this conference. Maybe you have a copy already. It summarizes the recent developments in the Nordic countries, as well as planned and ongoing joint action in the Nordic countries tackling sexual harassment. So you can find them both on nick.no. And I also want to tell you about the Nordic Gender Equality Fund that we have in our organization. It's a fund that supports cooperation on gender equality within the Nordic and Baltic region. And several Nordic projects have already been financed on sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And maybe some of you went to the session earlier this morning on where some of these projects were presented. So this is just shortly about what we're doing. But what I wanted to do today, I think, mainly was two things. I wanted to give some kind of baseline version of what is research actually saying on sexual harassment in the labor market. Not addressing you as an audience, but obviously you're my feminist fellows and you're much more into the issues, but this is actually addressing the Nordic labor market and the stakeholders out there. What are they supposed to do and how can they address sexual harassment? What are the baseline knowledge that we have at this moment? So I want to start out with doing that. So firstly, what are the causes of sexual harassment? Looking into research, globally speaking, for 40, 50 years, what can we say about the causes and the reasons? Well, of course, there's a misogynist, heterosexist culture, there's the gender power structures within organizations, we have dysfunctional working climate, and also the precarious employment conditions. There are also another 70, 80 causes, of course, but looking into this, there should be some simple answers on the Nordic labor market. Ending sexism completely would be the solution to sexist culture, right? Reorganizing work as such would actually end the gendered power structures. So why is not that done? Of course, it's a long-term challenge. It's really difficult, but why not start out offering permanent positions on Nordic labor market for all of us? Starting out right now, that would be a hands-on strategy for Nordic politics to address. But instead, there is a tendency to start, so to speak, on the other end, trying to, for example, implement zero tolerance on sexual harassment. But with no relevant measures taken combating what we know are the evidence-based causes of sexual harassment. There has to be a stop using strategies that are useless on the Nordic labor market. There has to be stop paying lip service. And looking into my other point is about preventive measures. What kind of preventive measures are taking place right now in the labor market? Well, we see that policy, training, case management, managing complaints, building some kind of support structures for those being harassed, we can see in research that they do not decrease the prevalence of sexual harassment in the labor market at all. And still, this is what we do. We invest so much time in the politics and training sessions, but actually it's not doing the trick. So instead, what research is calling for is knowledge and strategies that address the violence, the gender violence, the sexual violence, and sexual harassment as a continuum in women's lives, in their life stories, and some men's life stories. For example, if we are supposed to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, we have to address the total context of violence and also assume that the experience of violence are ever present in every workplace. So instead of doing things afterwards, when things already has happened, we have to combat the multiple experiences of violence always already being part of the working environment in the Nordic labor market. And I agree with focusing not on the women being exposed to harassment only. We have to look into the perpetrators. Who are they? What enables them? In what situation? On what conditions? And how are we as bystanders helping them to be perpetrators? So these are the tricky questions coming also from research. And my last point touches on an issue being really strongly represented here today and also on the conference, and the question of intersectionality. We can see from research that LGBTQ, race, class, religion, disability, age, and other factors increases the exposure to sexual harassment for women and some men in the labor market. Now, this is a fact. It's not something we have to discuss with our ministers, our managers in the Nordic labor market. The intersectionality is always in place in every workplace in the Nordic countries, and it's, of course, therefore, preventive measures taken without addressing these intersectionalities, they're bound to fail. We know that from research and from experience, and still, we do preventive work as if this is not an issue. To some sense, there has to be preventive work in the future that has to acknowledge multiple forms of violence and harassment, not only addressing the white, middle-class, heterosexual women's experiences of sexual harassment. You're supposed to say, woo, right now. So, what I want to do today is to talk to you about the reflections that I'd like to do, rereading a lot of the feminist literature on sexual harassment in the labor market and other feminist classics. And I spent a lot of time doing that, of course, in my life, but I have been rereading a lot of these important texts in different senses. And I started out preparing this presentation today by reading Catherine McKinnon's groundbreaking work on sexual harassment in workplaces. Something she continuously reflects upon and states is the following: the unnamed should not be mistaken for the non-existent. And to my mind, and I have to lean a bit, I'm too tall, I have to to my mind, what she's doing, she's urging for a process of naming the experience of sexual violence in times when this was a poorly recognized issue. Now, 40 years on, at this conference, where we're reflecting on the impact on the MeToo movement, we know that the MeToo movement has been an almost global process of naming and making existent the lived experiences and consequences of sexual violence and sexual harassment against women. And at the same time, politicians, managers, researchers, others are at best listening to women's experiences. But they're also taking part in this process of naming, learning the vocabularies of gender violence, toxic masculinities, intersectionality, and so forth. Now, this could be seen as actually moving forward, not backwards, right? But I'm not sure. To me, this gives a sense of things rather moving awkward, right? I think we need to constantly be really observant on how and if systematic injustices will be addressed properly in the future in the Nordic labor market. The current co-optation of concepts by those holding legitimate power positions in our societies is not necessarily a good thing. The co-optation of critical concepts usually ends up devaluing radical understandings of how power works. So when sexual harassment becomes a political common sense, it really runs the risk of losing its meaning and its transformational potential. So the process of naming sexual harassment, therefore, has to be a constant process of reclaiming this concept as such. And this turns me to my other quote. I read Hannah Arendt's work on violence, written during the student revolt 1968, when flying into Iceland. I reread it once again and once and again. It's a quite interesting text because it's really intriguing, sometimes really disturbing. But what she says about power and how to make power legitimate is quite interesting. She writes, "Power springs up whenever people get together and act in concert, but it derives its legitimacy from the initial getting together, rather than from any action that then may then follow." So the MeToo movement, who am I to comment the MeToo movement? But still I'm trying. I think it constantly runs the risk of losing its instant legitimacy, simply because getting together, as Hannah Arendt pushes it in the streets, but in nowadays in social media, is always already counteracted by the conditions under which we live. It's a time-consuming, individualist, neoliberal, capitalist, unequal, anomic society that surrounds us, right? As Angela Davis, she pointed it out really clearly on the first day on the conference, violence permeates every instance of our political systems. How can we come together under such circumstances? So what Hannah Arendt does is she points to the need to ask questions on how to maintain the legitimacy of the power of the MeToo movement as the initial getting together actually is over. And this touches on the burning questions of solidarity and sisterhood in many, many ways. The Nordic countries, driven, historically speaking, by the women's movement, deeply embedded strong welfare models, gender equality politics for decades, are still sexist and thoroughly racist communities. So sisterhood is not a self-evident part of our current political systems and organizations and communities. And I can't spell her name properly, but the brilliant feminist writer, Chandra Tapalade Mohanty, right? She writes some important stuff about sisterhood in a great book, Feminism Without Borders. She claims that sisterhood cannot be assumed on the basis of gender. It must be forged in concrete historical and political practice and analysis. What Mohanty repeatedly shows is how sexism, racism, ableism, ageism must be tackled simultaneously from intersectional points of view by several actors from different parts of society in collaboration. So what is crucial, I think, is continuing an ongoing and loud feminist practice and analysis in stating solidarity as the means of ending sexual violence. And among many other things, of course, I think we have to ensure reasonable terms for feminist research in its widest sense to have a strong place in the Nordic countries. This is the core knowledge regime needed in order to develop new ways to end intersectional sexual violence. And finally, there's just 1.5 minutes left to go. What is striking to me in the aftermath of the MeToo movement is, of course, women's clear-cut demands of not only combating sexual harassment or reducing the levels of gender violence, but simply ending violence altogether as the only reasonable way forward. And I guess the future will tell us if the MeToo movement, being unreasonable in that sense, was actually the turning point in history or not. Hannah Arendt put it this way 50 years ago. To ask the impossible in order to obtain the possible is not always counterproductive. That's it.